Algoma Steel has signed a binding memorandum of understanding with South Korean shipbuilder Hanwha Ocean to the tune of $345 million. The signing ceremony took place earlier today with Ontario Trade Minister Vic Fedeli in attendance. It's predicated on the South Korean business winning the federal contract to build a fleet of submarines for the Canadian military.
Canada has just pulled off one of the most significant industrial moves of the year. Algoma Steel secured a $345 million partnership tied directly to South Korea's bid to build Canada's next fleet of submarines. A deal that doesn't just revive Ontario steel, but shifts the balance of power in North America's supply chains. At a time when Donald Trump believes he can squeeze Canada with escalating tariffs, regulatory threats, and geopolitical pressure, Ottawa has quietly taken a critical piece of the defense industrial puzzle out of America's hands and anchored it inside a new Canada-Korea ecosystem. This is the clearest signal yet that Canada has stopped playing by Washington's script.
The agreement between Algoma Steel and Hanwha Ocean commits up to $345 million for the construction of a structural steel beam mill in Sault Ste. Marie if South Korea wins the contract to deliver up to 12 Canadian Patrol Submarine Project vessels. This investment immediately changes the trajectory of Canada's heavy industry landscape. For Algoma, it is a path to restore lost jobs and rebuild long-term industrial capacity. For Hanwha, it is an entry point into one of the most strategically important defense procurements Canada has undertaken in decades. The deal fits seamlessly into Ottawa's Buy Canadian policy, which requires major foreign bidders to produce real domestic industrial benefits. Canada isn't simply buying ships, it is restructuring its own industrial base. And this arrives just as Canada debates another procurement question, the choice between the US F-35 and Sweden's Gripen. If the F-35 ties Canada even deeper into US dependency, the Gripen offers more control over training, maintenance, and intellectual property. In many ways, that debate mirrors today's steel decision. Canada is choosing diversification, flexibility, and sovereignty over automatic alignment with Washington.
In early 2026, Washington's pressure campaign shifted into a new phase. After Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he warned of a fractured global system and urged middle-power democracies to diversify their economic ties, the White House reacted with visible irritation. Carney's remarks were interpreted as a direct challenge to Washington's habit of using trade as leverage, and Trump wasted no time responding. He first threatened Canada with a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods should Ottawa move forward with deeper engagement with China. Then he turned eastward, targeting South Korea with a sudden tariff hike, raising duties on Korean autos, lumber, and pharmaceuticals from the negotiated 15% ceiling to 25%, a punitive response to Seoul's slow movement on a U.S. trade framework. The message was unmistakable. If a partner did not align with America's political priorities, economic pressure would follow. And the escalation continued. On January 29th, Trump pushed the confrontation into unprecedented territory by announcing plans to hit Canadian aerospace exports with 50% tariffs, while simultaneously threatening to decertify Bombardier's Global Express aircraft unless Canada aligned its certification decisions with U.S. demands. It was a stunning blend of regulatory coercion and trade retaliation, directed squarely at one of Canada's most important high-tech sectors. These moves came against a broader backdrop of U.S. pressure over Arctic security and Greenland policy, but the real pattern was simpler. Washington was squeezing both Canada and South Korea at the exact moment the two countries were deepening defense industrial cooperation. That is what makes the Algoma-Hanwha Steel deal so strategically powerful. Instead of caving to tariff threats, Canada responded by re-engineering its supply chain, tying a major defense procurement to domestic steel production and a long-term partnership with a country that is also facing U.S. pressure. The deal isn't just an industrial investment, it is a structural countermove against Washington's leverage. By shifting submarine-grade steel production into Canada, Ottawa reduces the number of economic choke points the United States can exploit and strengthens an alternative network that connects Canadian workers and Korean capital outside of Washington's reach.
Washington has long treated Canada's industrial base as an extension of its own, assuming that Canadian shipyards, steel mills, and aerospace manufacturers would ultimately depend on American suppliers. That assumption no longer holds. With this deal, Canada begins shifting core components of its defense supply chain back home. High-strength steel for submarine hulls will no longer be exposed to American tariffs or political uncertainty. And the deeper Canada builds this domestic capacity, the less influence Washington retains over Canadian industrial decisions. Just as the Gripen proposal challenges the idea that Canadian air power must be American-built, the Algoma-Hanwha plan challenges the belief that North American naval production must flow through U.S. supply lines.
Carney has been explicit. Canada must become the customer of its own economic strength. This deal is the clearest practical example of that philosophy. Instead of purchasing foreign hardware and accepting foreign dependencies, Canada is using procurement to expand domestic capabilities, worker skills, industrial output, and supply chain resilience. It is a shift from passive procurement to active statecraft, and it represents a Canada that sees industrial sovereignty not as an aspiration, but as a strategic requirement.
For decades, the United States assumed that major Canadian defense programs, especially submarines, would naturally fall under American influence, whether through materials, certification, or intellectual property. But Canada's pivot toward Korea signals a different future. South Korea is emerging as a global powerhouse in advanced shipbuilding, and it is willing to invest heavily in Canada to win the contract. For Trump, this is not just a commercial loss, it is a loss of leverage. Tariffs no longer push Canada back into the American orbit, when Canada is actively building economic partnerships that bypass Washington. Every investment that strengthens Canadian autonomy weakens Washington's assumption of Canadian compliance.
The Algoma-Hanwha deal is not a reaction, it is preparation. Canada is designing a future where critical inputs for national defense cannot be disrupted by U.S. politics, U.S. tariffs, or U.S. regulatory threats. If the F-35 debate hinted at Canada's desire for more sovereignty in the air, and if Carney's Davos speech signaled a philosophical break from the old dependency model, then this steel mill is the material proof that the shift is real. Canada isn't just diversifying partners. Canada is positioning itself to withstand pressure and even outmaneuver it.
Viewed narrowly, a $345 million steel investment may look like industrial policy, but in the context of tariff threats, aerospace retaliation, and a U.S. government pressuring both Canada and Korea at the same time, it becomes something much larger. If Hanwha wins the submarine contract, Canada will not only receive new underwater capability, it will gain a strengthened industrial base, a domestic steel source insulated from tariffs, and a long-term partnership that Washington cannot easily disrupt. And the question now is unavoidable. If Canada can reclaim steel, diversify its air power, and build submarines outside the U.S. orbit, what exactly is left for Trump to leverage?
This is Hanwha's KSS-3 submarine, launched into the sea just in time for the Prime Minister's visit. Mark Carney climbed down 7 meters to check out what the South Koreans want Canada to buy.
When you walk through the Hanwha Ocean shipyard in South Korea, you can feel the weight of industry. Towering cranes, welding sparks, and steel hulls taking shape on the water. It is one of the largest shipyards in Asia, 5 square kilometers of pure precision and ambition. And in late October 2025, amid that metallic rhythm, one visitor stood out: Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Cameras followed him as he toured the submarine line that could soon redefine Canada's Navy. Hanwha Ocean is one of 2 finalists competing to replace Canada's aging Victoria-class submarines. The South Koreans promised 12 new KS-3 boats, 4 by 2035, if a deal is signed by 2026. That single image, Carney standing among South Korean engineers, carried more meaning than a press statement ever could. While Donald Trump was in another city, warning allies to buy American and tightening tariff walls, Carney was moving in the opposite direction. He was in Asia, exploring technology and partnerships the United States could no longer offer. For Canada, this wasn't just a defense procurement trip. It was a declaration of independence, an unmistakable signal that Ottawa is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to modernize.
The story behind Carney's visit runs deeper than submarines. It reflects a global realignment, now visible from Ottawa to Seoul. In recent years, South Korea has earned a new nickname, the Arsenal of Democracy. Once a nation rebuilt from the ashes of war, it is now on course to become the world's 4th largest weapons exporter. Korean firms have delivered artillery to Poland, tanks to Australia, and air defense systems to NATO allies. Now, they are bidding to build Canada's next fleet of submarines, a contract worth between 20 and 24 billion US dollars. What makes Seoul's offer so attractive is speed and partnership. The KS-3 submarines are already operational for the Korean Navy. They can be built within the next decade using advanced robotics and modular construction. The proposal even includes technology transfer, crew training, and the creation of maintenance facilities on Canadian soil. It's not a one-off transaction. Seoul's Deputy Defense Minister has called it a long-term partnership aimed at strengthening Canada's own defense industry. That approach stands in sharp contrast to traditional American deals, which often keep production and intellectual property inside the U.S. border. For Carney, the choice is symbolic. By engaging South Korea, Canada is signaling to the world and to Washington that it will not be confined to a single industrial orbit. It is building new supply chains and friendships in Asia, where technology and cooperation come without the constant shadow of tariffs and political strings. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look at what's happening on the other side of the Pacific. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has rebuilt his economic playbook around protectionism. Under the America First agenda, his administration has imposed sweeping import taxes ranging from 10 to 100%. Canada has been hit particularly hard, facing a 25% tariff on most industrial goods and an additional 10% on energy. For Ottawa, those measures have disrupted trade worth over $120 billion annually. Instead of retaliating, Carney's government chose a more strategic path. It began shifting Canada's defense and technology partnerships towards Asia, where nations like South Korea and Japan were eager to cooperate without political tension. That shift is not just economic. It's geopolitical. Every submarine Canada builds with Seoul, every maintenance contract it signs outside the U.S. is a quiet rebalance of power. It chips away at Washington's decades-long dominance over North American industry. In short, Trump's tariffs have accelerated exactly what he hoped to prevent: the diversification of Western allies away from U.S. factories. By pushing partners to the edge, the White House has forced them to find new routes, and Canada is proving that independence can be a strategy, not a risk.
It's hard to miss the symbolism. At the end of October, both Donald Trump and Mark Carney were in South Korea, but for entirely different missions. Trump met President Lee Jae-myung to finalize a $350 billion U.S.-Korea trade framework focused on reshoring and tight supply chain control. Carney, meanwhile, visited GOJ, where Korean engineers built submarines for their own navy. Two Western leaders, one country, two opposite visions. Trump came to enforce American terms, Carney came to forge new ones. One relied on tariffs, the other on trust. This contrast captures the fracture in today's Western order. The old model, Washington dictates, allies follow, is breaking apart. Canada's outreach to South Korea represents a new approach, where middle powers collaborate directly and trade capability, not obedience. As Trump's motorcade departed Seoul, Carney's team entered Hanwha's shipyard. For historians, it might mark the week Canada stopped orbiting Washington and started steering its own course in Asia.
A year ago, Canada seemed like a casualty of Trump's trade war. Tariffs on steel, autos, and lumber cut exports and threatened jobs. Economists warned of long-term damage. But by late 2025, the narrative has flipped. Instead of pleading for tariff relief, Canada is rebuilding through new alliances. Deals with Japan, South Korea, and Australia now anchor its industrial strategy. Partnerships that share technology instead of imposing restrictions. The submarine talks are more than procurement. They represent who controls the engines of innovation. If the deal goes through, it will bring thousands of jobs, advanced robotics training, and new supply chain opportunities inside Canada. More importantly, it proves that Canada can prosper outside America's shadow.
Trump's tariffs tried to isolate Ottawa, but instead propelled it toward a network of Asian democracies eager for cooperation. Government officials expect the first submarines by 2035, the same year the USMCA review is due. By then, Canada's defense network could stretch from Vancouver to Busan, not just from Ottawa to Washington. The message is clear. While the US builds walls, Canada builds bridges. Partnership has replaced dependency. Strategy has replaced fear. And as the clang of steel echoed through Hanwha shipyard, it symbolized something larger than a contract. The moment a nation reclaimed control of its industrial future.
From afar, it might look like an ordinary diplomatic visit. But in the global story of 2025, Carney's stop in South Korea speaks volumes. It shows that alliances are shifting and that middle powers like Canada can redefine their destiny without waiting for Washington. In a world dominated by tariffs and trade wars, this submarine project isn't just about ships under the sea, it's about a country surfacing with a new sense of confidence. Because while others build barriers, Canada is quietly forging steel, and with it, a new path forward.